Your very first water-based clay assignment will be to create a stamp of your initials so that you can use the stamp to label your clay assignments. So you can see I just press my initials into the soft clay, and that way my name is on my things that I make. We'll be using this gray clay. It's called low fire white clay. It fires at a low temperature and it turns white in the kiln. So you'll need a chunk of soft clay. You'll also need something to work on. You can work on your table, but sometimes you'll pick up debris from the table, which is not fun. So you can get a canvas board, which is just a wooden board with canvas on it, or you can get just a regular wood board like I have. Just some area to work on so that your clay doesn't go everywhere and your clay doesn't pick up things that it shouldn't off of the table. You may also need a spray bottle, as the clay is water-based, and as it sits out it begins to dry up. And if we want it to be nice and soft and moldable, we have to keep adding water to it to prevent it from drying up, because when it dries up it's hard to work with. So we're going to begin by just creating the very head of the stamp. We're not worried about our initials yet. We're not worried about this part, which is the handle of the stamp, but just this part right here, this general form. And I'm going to make it a lot longer, and we'll be cutting it down later. So as you can see, the form that I created is kind of like a cylinder, only it's more of an oval shape rather than a circle shape at the end of it. So decide what kind of form you would like to create. It can be a rectangular prism with a square end. It could be totally round like a cylinder. It can be however you would like it to be. Okay, so first what I'm going to do is take my clay and I'm going to throw it down on the board lightly so that any air bubbles that are in the clay will be beaten out of the clay. They'll come to the surface and they'll pop. And we wedge the clay because we don't want air bubbles in the clay, because if it goes in the kiln with air bubbles in it, the clay will explode because the air that's trapped will expand and try to get out. Okay, so this is good enough. Now what I'm going to do is just begin my form, similar to your geometric forms that you created with the modeling clay. So decide, do you want it round? Do you want it squarish? Decide where you'd like to start. So I'm going to roll the clay back and forth. And rolling clay, water-based clay, is a little bit different than rolling modeling clay, and you'll feel that as you start to work with the clay. The size of the head of the stamp should be about the size of a nickel. And while mine is definitely not this width, in this dimension, the size of a nickel, but it's about the width of a nickel. So we don't want it too small because then it's very difficult to carve away. And so what I'm doing now is I'm just kind of using my hands to smooth over the clay. If I wanted it more rectangular, I could start to tap the clay down. So you're going to get just the general form of the stamp started. And make sure your clay is really smooth. If you see cracks forming in the clay or your clay becomes hard to mold, you can give a little spritz with the water bottle. You can kind of work the water into the clay and it will soften up. It will soften up just a little bit. Okay, so I have my general form. It's a lot longer than it needs to be. But the ends are pretty rough, and I could mold them with my fingertips, but I want it totally level and flat, and so to do that I'll use an X-Acto knife. So to use an X-Acto knife, you hold it like this, and you make sure that this head part is tightened in so it's not going to fall out. So you hold it like this, and then I usually put my finger on top so I can kind of press down as I cut through the clay. So I'm going to line it up and just try to make a nice, totally flat cut through the clay. And then I'll take that piece away. And then you can see the head of that. I'm going to just smooth it over a little bit because it's not quite as smooth as it could be. Maybe even just tap it lightly on the board so it completely levels out. So I have this sort of rectangular shape. It's a little bit rounded on the corners, and I like that, so I'm going to keep that. So about the size of a nickel, it should be totally smooth, and you should cut it and tap it so that it's totally level. Okay, so this is extra clay. I can put this back where the clay goes as long as it's still soft. The X-Acto knives, we never leave at the tables because putting them inside of our clay tool bins might be a little dangerous. So make sure that it's cleaned off. If you need to clean it in the sink, you can do that. Make sure there's no clay on it. And then you'll return it to me because I keep it in a special place. Okay, now we cannot start carving our initials because the clay is too soft. If we try to carve into the clay, we'll just be mushing the clay around and it won't come off very easily. So what I'm going to do is take my clay stamp and I'm going to put it in a Meyer bag or a plastic bag, some kind of plastic. And I'm going to just real loosely wrap it in the bag like this because I want it to dry up just a little bit. So loosely in the bag. And then what I'll do is I'll store this overnight in my locker, my storage locker or bin. And then the following day it will be ready to be carved. So we'll go through that process the following day. So remember, give me the X-Acto knives back. If you have clay on the board, you can take a sponge and wipe it. If the clay board has any moisture on it, like you can see there is water here, we don't want to stack boards together as they can mold. So I need to find a space to just set this out. If we have no other classes in this room, you can leave it on your table. Otherwise, the counter is where you can put your boards. And you'll make sure that you clean up your mess, put any clay back, wash your hands to complete the process.